You pull into the driveway, and before you've even turned off the engine, something in your posture changes. Your shoulders drop a half inch. Your voice, when you say hello at the door, arrives half an octave higher than it was 20 minutes ago on the phone with a friend. By the time you're sitting at the table, you notice it, distantly, the way you'd notice weather. You have become someone slightly different than the person who drove here. Not fake, exactly. Just older or younger, depending on which relative is in the room. More careful, more responsible, or more silent, or more eager to make someone laugh before the tension in the kitchen gets a chance to settle. You run a company, or you raise your own children, or you've built a life entirely out of reach of anyone in this house, and none of it seems to matter the moment your mother asks, in that particular tone, whether you're eating enough. Who are you when you're around the people who knew you before you knew yourself? That question sits underneath a great deal of adult life, mostly unexamined, because it rarely gets asked directly. It hides inside smaller questions instead. Why do I feel 13 again during Thanksgiving dinner? Why does one sentence from my father undo an entire year of therapy in 4 seconds? Why do I know exactly how to keep the peace in this specific room, automatically, without deciding to, as if some older, more practiced version of me has been sitting dormant, waiting for exactly this address to wake back up? Families, it turns out, do not simply love their members, they assign them. Long before anyone in the house had the language for psychology, a kind of casting process was already underway, quiet, largely unconscious, distributing roles the way any system under pressure distributes function, according to what the system needed, not according to who each person actually was underneath. This is where the deeper work begins, tracing the specific role you were handed, understanding why it was handed to you, and asking the harder question underneath all of it. Which parts of who you are, right now, are actually yours, and which parts were simply what someone else needed you to be, so consistently, for so long, that you stopped being able to tell the difference. Children do not arrive into a family and simply discover who they are in isolation. They arrive into an already running emotional system, parents with their own unresolved histories, siblings competing for finite attention, a particular household climate that rewards certain behaviors and quietly punishes others. And children, being remarkably perceptive long before they're rational, read that climate with startling accuracy. They learn, often before they can properly speak, which version of themselves produces safety, approval, calm, affection, and which version produces conflict, disappointment, or a silence that feels far more dangerous than shouting ever could. This learning does not feel like learning a role. It feels like discovering who you are. That's precisely what makes it so durable. Nobody sits a child down and assigns them a job title. The job simply becomes the most efficient path to love in a specific environment, and the child, adapting the way children always adapt, takes the job, wears it, and eventually forgets it was ever handed to them at all. It's worth pausing on how early this casting actually begins, because it starts well before a child has any real capacity for choice in the matter. Infants read facial expression and tone before they read words. A household's baseline emotional temperature, anxious, volatile, warm, distant, becomes the water a child swims in so early and so completely that questioning it doesn't occur to them any more than a fish questions the ocean. By the time a child is old enough to describe their own personality, the personality being described has already been shaped, considerably, by years of unconscious negotiation with an environment they never chose. Picture a household where a parent's anxiety runs the emotional weather. One child, without ever being asked, starts monitoring for signs of an approaching storm, and starts learning to handle whatever the adults in the house are failing to handle. Bills get quietly organized. Younger siblings get quietly managed. That child becomes competent very early, sometimes strikingly so, and the family, relieved, begins leaning on that competence more and more. If I don't handle it, nobody will. That sentence, formed at 8 or 9 or 11 years old, rarely stays contained to childhood. It becomes an operating principle, carried forward into every subsequent relationship, every job, every crisis, large or small. The adult version of that child often cannot rest without guilt sitting somewhere nearby, cannot ask for help without a strange, disproportionate shame attaching itself to the request, automatically absorbs responsibility for other people's emotional states, even in rooms where nobody actually asked them to. This is what Jung meant by the persona, though it rarely gets described this specifically. The persona is not simply the face you show the world. It is the specific costume a person builds to remain safe and valued inside a particular system, and the responsible child's costume is competence, permanent, tireless, without visible cracks. It worked. That was never the problem. The problem is that a costume built for survival at 8 years old rarely gets updated once the actual danger has passed. And so, the fully grown adult, decades later, financially stable, surrounded by people who would gladly help if asked, still cannot put the costume down, because some part of them is still operating as though the entire household depends on it. There's a particular cruelty hidden inside this specific role that rarely gets named directly. The responsible child is often praised extravagantly for their maturity, their capability, their steadiness, and that praise, however well-intentioned, quietly confirms the arrangement rather than questioning it. Nobody thanks the responsible child by asking what they need. They thank them by relying on them further. And a child who has learned that reliability is the currency of love will keep spending it indefinitely, without ever pausing to ask whether the exchange rate was ever fair to begin with. There's a different costume worn by a different kind of child, one shaped not by a parent's chaos but by a parent's temper, or by tension between two adults that never quite resolves. That child learns something else entirely, an acute, almost supernatural sensitivity to the emotional temperature of a room. They can read a slight change in someone's jaw before a word is spoken. They know, instinctively, which topics to steer away from, which jokes will land, which silence needs to be filled, and which one needs to be left alone. This child becomes the peacemaker, and the role, like the responsible child's, begins as something genuinely useful. It keeps the household functioning. It prevents blow-ups. It earns, quietly, a specific kind of approval, the appreciation reserved for the child who never causes problems. What happens when keeping everyone comfortable becomes more important than knowing what you actually feel? This is the quiet cost of the peacemaker's role, one that rarely gets noticed until well into adulthood. A person who has spent decades monitoring everyone else's emotional state can often answer, in exhausting detail, what their partner is feeling, what their co-worker is upset about, what their friend needs right now. Ask that same person what they themselves want in a given moment, and something strange happens. A pause, a slight blankness. The instrument built to read everyone else was never really pointed inward, because pointing it inward was never what the role required. There's a version of the peacemaker worth naming separately, because it complicates the role in a way that's often overlooked. Some peacemakers didn't simply learn to read tension. They learned to preempt it, to become entertaining, agreeable, endlessly easygoing, so that conflict never had the chance to arrive in the first place. This looks, from the outside, like an easy, low-maintenance personality, and it's often praised as exactly that. Underneath it, though, is frequently a person who has never once tested what happens if they simply say what they actually think, because the entire architecture of their childhood safety depended on never finding out. Then there's the child who becomes, in the family's language, the difficult one. And it's worth being careful here, because this role gets flattened constantly into a simple story about a troubled kid who made bad choices, when the actual mechanism underneath it is considerably stranger and considerably more revealing. Families, like any system, generate tension they'd rather not examine directly. Sometimes that tension needs somewhere to go, and it finds, almost unerringly, the child least equipped to absorb it quietly. the one whose temperament runs hotter, whose sensitivity to injustice runs sharper, whose nervous system simply refuses to perform the calm the rest of the household has agreed to maintain. That child starts expressing, loudly and visibly, exactly what everyone else has learned to keep silent. And the family, rather than examining what that expression might actually be pointing to, often responds by locating the problem entirely inside the child. The difficult one, the dramatic one, the one who can't just let things go. Was the problem child always the problem? Or were they simply the one member of the system honest enough or unguarded enough to express what the whole family had collectively decided never to look at directly? This is the shadow operating at a family level rather than an individual one, the unacceptable material, the anger nobody was allowed to have, the resentment nobody was permitted to name, gathering somewhere in the family's collective unconscious and eventually finding a single member willing, whether by temperament or circumstance, to carry it on everyone's behalf. That child often grows into an adult who spends years believing something is fundamentally wrong with them, without ever considering the possibility that they were simply cast, early and without consent, as the container for a family's disowned material. There's a specific, painful irony that tends to follow the scapegoat into adulthood. Having been blamed for years for disrupting a peace that was never real to begin with, they often become hypervigilant about their own behavior, terrified of confirming the old label, second-guessing every expression of frustration long after leaving the household that first assigned it to them. Meanwhile, the family, having successfully located its tension in one convenient place, often experiences genuine relief whenever that person is absent, relief that gets misread by everyone, including the scapegoat themselves, as evidence that the family functions better without them, rather than what it actually is, a system continuing to avoid the material it was never willing to face directly. Siblings complicate this considerably, because comparison rarely announces itself directly. It operates through smaller signals, an offhand comment at dinner, a particular pride in one child's report card that never quite extends to the others, and children absorb these signals with devastating precision. One becomes the smart one becomes the beautiful one becomes, quietly, without anyone ever saying it aloud, the disappointing one, simply by comparison to whichever sibling was cast in the more favorable role. What's strange, and worth sitting with honestly, is how long this comparison outlives its original context. Two adult siblings can be, by any external measure, on entirely separate paths, no longer competing for anything real. And still, one of them feels a small, unwelcome tightening in the chest whenever the other's success comes up in conversation, still measures their own life, unconsciously, against a version of their sibling that exists mostly in memory now, frozen at roughly the age comparison first began. You may no longer be competing with your sibling. You may still be competing with the version of them your family built inside your head decades ago and never bothered to update. This comparison often produces an unexpected consequence worth naming directly, one that shows up in how siblings relate to each other as adults, rather than simply in how they relate to their parents. Two people who might, under different circumstances, have become genuinely close, often carry an old, unspoken wariness toward each other well into adulthood, each one still faintly bracing for the comparison to resurface, each one unconsciously guarding territory, the smart one protecting their intellectual identity, the beautiful one protecting an identity built on appearance, neither one fully able to relax into a relationship that was, from very early on, quietly structured as a competition neither of them designed. Being named the favorite carries its own quieter cost, one that rarely gets acknowledged because it looks, from the outside, like nothing but privilege, but approval that arrives conditionally, tied to maintaining a specific identity, a specific set of achievements, a specific personality that pleases, becomes its own kind of enclosure. The favorite child often learns early that love is not unconditional in practice, however unconditional it's described in principle, and spends years afterward, sometimes an entire adulthood, terrified of the version of themselves that might finally disappoint. The overlooked child carries a different weight, though it can produce a strangely similar outcome. Attention that never quite arrived becomes something to be earned, indefinitely, through achievement, through usefulness, through becoming impossible to overlook. Both children, the favorite and the invisible one, can end up in the same place decades later, an adult still quietly performing for an audience that stopped watching a long time ago, if it was ever really watching in the way that child needed at all. Each of these roles, whatever shape it took, began as intelligent adaptation. A child figuring out, correctly, what a specific environment required in order to receive love, or safety, or simply to be left alone. This is the persona doing exactly what it was built to do. The trouble surfaces later, when the environment changes and the costume doesn't. The role that once protected you is very often the same role that eventually restricts you. This is not a contradiction. It's simply what happens when a survival strategy outlives the conditions that made it necessary. This is where the family complex deserves closer attention, because it explains something that otherwise looks bizarre from the outside. A fully grown, capable adult reduced, in a single phone call with a parent, to something that looks and sounds remarkably like a child. Not figuratively, physiologically. The voice changes, the posture changes. Decisions that would take 30 seconds in any other context suddenly require permission that was never actually being asked for. A complex, in the psychological sense, is not simply a memory. It's an emotionally charged cluster of experience, formed early, that continues operating with something close to its own gravitational pull long after the original circumstances have passed. Family complexes are often the deepest and most stubborn of all, because they were formed during the years when a person's sense of identity was still being built by the very people responsible for building it. How much of your reaction in that moment on the phone actually belongs to the present conversation? And how much belongs to every version of this same exchange that came before it, stretching back decades, activated instantly, without your permission, the moment a familiar tone of voice arrives? This is why a 35-year-old, entirely composed in every other domain of their life, can find themselves reduced to something close to panic by a single disapproving comment from a parent, a reaction that would seem wildly disproportionate to anyone watching who doesn't understand what's actually being triggered. It isn't really about the comment. The comment is simply the key. The lock it's turning was built decades earlier, and it still, apparently, fits. There's a physical dimension to this worth naming, because the complex rarely announces itself through thought first. It arrives through the body, a tightening in the chest before a parent has finished a sentence, a sudden urge to leave the room that has nothing to do with anything currently being discussed, a specific, familiar heaviness that settles in almost the instant a certain car pulls into a certain driveway. The body, in these moments, is often the most honest narrator available, registering the activation of an old pattern well before the conscious mind has caught up enough to explain what's actually happening. Growth complicates this considerably, because change inside a person doesn't automatically produce change inside the system that person came from. You establish a boundary you never had before. You stop over-explaining decisions that used to require lengthy justification. You start making choices that reflect who you've actually become, rather than who you were cast as at 11 years old. And the family, having built an entire relationship around the earlier version, often responds with something that sounds like an accusation. You've changed. It's worth sitting with what that sentence actually means, because it rarely means what it appears to mean on the surface. Sometimes it's a genuine, if clumsy, expression of missing an earlier closeness. But often, examined honestly, "you've changed" is simply a different way of saying, "you no longer play the role I built my comfort around." And the discomfort being expressed has less to do with who you've become and more to do with a system that now has to find a new equilibrium, one it never asked for and doesn't yet know how to build. This doesn't make families villains. Most people participating in these systems are not doing so with any conscious intent to harm. They're operating from their own complexes, their own inherited roles, their own family systems, one generation back, doing the best they know how to do with tools that were, in many cases, handed down without much scrutiny at all. A parent who demands constant reassurance from their responsible child was very likely, in their own childhood, someone's responsible child too, or someone's invisible one, carrying forward a script they never consciously chose either, simply passing along the only architecture they were ever given. Understanding this doesn't excuse genuine harm where it occurred, but it does complicate the simpler story where someone is simply the villain and someone else is simply the victim, because most family systems are considerably more tangled than that. Generations of unexamined roles feeding into one another, largely invisible to everyone still standing inside them. Every family, in enforcing its particular roles, also teaches its members which qualities are unacceptable. A household uncomfortable with anger raises children who learn to disown their own. A household uncomfortable with ambition, perhaps out of its own unspoken insecurity, raises children who learn to shrink their own wanting. A household where sensitivity was mocked raises children who build thick, protective armor around anything resembling vulnerability. A household where sexuality was treated as shameful raises children who spend years, sometimes a lifetime, disconnected from an entire dimension of themselves. These disowned qualities don't disappear simply because they were exiled. They go somewhere, into what Jung called the shadow, and from there, they continue exerting influence, often through the people we find ourselves unable to stop noticing. The confident stranger who unsettles you slightly more than seems reasonable. The ambitious colleague whose drive you find yourself quietly resenting. The openly emotional friend whose ease with vulnerability makes you strangely uncomfortable to be around. In each case, the intensity of the reaction is often less about the other person and more about a part of yourself, exiled long ago by a family that couldn't hold it, finally being glimpsed, alive and unapologetic, in someone else. This is where the deeper work becomes possible, and it's worth being precise about what that work actually is, because it gets misunderstood constantly. It is not about cutting off your family. It is not about assigning blame, however satisfying blame might feel in a particular moment. It is not about rejecting everything you were taught, as though nothing from that system holds any value. The actual question underneath all of it is quieter and considerably more demanding. Which parts of you are genuinely yours? And which parts were built because someone, at some point, needed you to be that person, so consistently, for so long, that the role hardened into something indistinguishable from identity? Jung called the process of untangling this individuation, and it's worth being honest about what individuation actually requires, because it's slower and less dramatic than most stories about self-discovery suggest. It doesn't happen through a single confrontation, a single cathartic conversation with a parent that resolves everything at once. It happens through small, repeated moments of choosing differently, noticed clearly, one at a time, over years. The responsible child, at some point, has to say, out loud, to someone who's counting on the old arrangement, "I can't take this on right now," not dramatically, not as a declaration of independence, simply, quietly, as a fact, and then living inside the discomfort that follows, because the discomfort is not evidence of having done something wrong. It's evidence that an old, familiar structure is finally being asked to bend. The peacemaker, at some point, has to let someone else stay upset without immediately rushing to fix it, without absorbing responsibility for a feeling that was never actually theirs to manage. This will likely feel, the first several times, like a small betrayal. It is not. It is simply the peacemaker discovering that peace maintained by constant self-erasure was never really peace at all. The peacemaker, at some point, has to let someone else stay upset, without immediately rushing to fix it, without absorbing responsibility for a feeling that was never actually theirs to manage. This will likely feel, the first several times, like a small betrayal. It is not. It is simply the peacemaker discovering that peace maintained by constant self-erasure was never really peace at all. The invisible child, at some point, has to stop performing for an audience that stopped watching long ago, has to risk being seen and, disturbingly, sometimes still overlooked, without that outcome collapsing their entire sense of worth the way it once would have. The rebellious one has to discover, slowly, that disagreement doesn't have to detonate an entire relationship, that it's possible to hold a boundary and remain in the room, something the original family system may never have modeled as a real possibility. The achiever has to sit, uncomfortably, with the strange, almost frightening experience of being loved without having just accomplished anything, has to learn, gradually, that this kind of love is not a trick, even though every old instinct insists it must be, and the strong one, the one who has spent decades being the reliable center of every storm, has to say, finally, to someone, "I need help," and discover, often to their own genuine surprise, that the roof does not, in fact, cave in. None of this requires severing the relationship entirely, though for some people, in some specific circumstances, distance turns out to be the only honest option available. For most, the work is subtler than departure. It's staying in relationship with people you love, while quietly, deliberately, refusing to keep performing a version of yourself that stopped being true a long time ago, and tolerating the friction that refusal inevitably produces, because friction, in this specific context, is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It's a sign that something real is finally happening. It's worth being honest, too, that this process rarely moves forward cleanly. Old roles have a way of reasserting themselves during exactly the moments a person can least afford it. A family crisis, a holiday, a late-night phone call during an already difficult week, precisely when exhaustion leaves the least energy available to resist an old, automatic pattern. This isn't evidence that the work has failed. Complexes formed over decades don't dissolve on a fixed timeline, and the more realistic expectation is not a single, permanent transformation, but a slow lengthening of the moments where a different choice becomes genuinely available, even while the old pull remains detectable somewhere underneath. There's a question worth returning to now, the same one sitting quietly underneath everything explored so far. If your family had never needed you to be the responsible one, the quiet one, the strong one, the difficult one, the successful one, who might you have become instead? There's no clean answer to that question, and any answer offered too quickly would be dishonest, a tidy resolution to something that was never meant to resolve tidily. What's available instead is simply the asking itself, returned to again and again in quieter moments, at family tables, on phone calls that used to end in the same familiar tightness, in the split second before an old, automatic role starts to take over, and a different, more deliberate choice becomes, for the first time, genuinely possible. You will likely walk back into that house again. The driveway will still be there. Something in your posture may still shift, at least a little, the moment you cross the threshold, because roles built over decades rarely dissolve completely, and that isn't a failure. What can change, slowly, with enough attention, is what happens next. Whether the old role simply runs its familiar course uninterrupted, or whether, for the first time, there's a flicker of space between the role and the person still standing quietly underneath it, waiting, patiently, to finally be recognized as someone separate from the part they were once asked to play.